For someone looking for a compact portable music player but doesn't want something so small that it's fiddly to use, could Hidizs' new AP80 Pro be the one to go for? Well, that's what I aim to find out. So we have Hidizs AP80 Pro portable player. It's one of those little small players that, thanks to HiFiGo for sending me one for review. Now, it's not as small as an M5, but as you see in the screen, it's got more real estate for kind of, well, doing stuff. And I found the screen just a little bit too small in these, although I like the neatness of the M5. Well, it has a few different features too. Some similar, some different. Maybe looking around the design, it has, well, your 2.5mm balanced out, your 3.5mm standard out, and a Type-C USB, which can be used for input, output, and various features, which we'll see in a bit. A single micro SD card, and your usual controls: volume, power by pressing power, or screen on or off by pressing inwards, and your back, forward, and play. So, well, yes, and pretty screen art. Now, I like the idea of the larger screen. It's not particularly heavy, although I'd probably go for the side pocket rather than the shirt pocket with this. And, well, functionality-wise, it has a couple of interesting things. Probably the most interesting, if we go a little bit backwards on this, is the FM radio. Now, it says please insert headset. What I actually did is, it only works if you plug the FM radio in using the 3.5mm connector, where this, obviously, the cable acts as an aerial because I moved it around and experimented. There you can hit these buttons to auto search for a channel, and then once it hits a channel, it'll stop, or a blank spot, and then you can just hit plus and add the channel in there and get rid of them. So it's fairly basic, or you can manually select it by using sliding along and what have you. And if we hit these little setting things, and you can adjust search and sensitivity. You can play around with that. I think that's pretty cool, although you're limited. You can actually, I have done it, I've plugged in just a cable into the 3.5mm socket and headphones into the balanced and used it that way, so you can do that. Now, one of the other things which is we saw on the M5 and the like is a step counter. Now, step counters are, well, that's very basic. It's not an Apple Watch. I mean, you have to consider that these things are made in China for Chinese customers very often, and a lot of them may not be able to afford, for an Apple Watch. This may be an expensive device for them, and it's kind of, well, you'll see a number come up in a bit. It's kind of, primitive and basic, but it can record stuff, and it does have a little calendar there, although it doesn't, it's kind of very primitive, but, it might suit someone, but I thought I'd just mention it anyway. So that's the kind of, I like the idea of the FM radio, which could be handy. As far as things go, about this particular version, I've only got version 1.0 on here. Now, if you are watching this video sometime in the future and you're thinking, I'm thinking of buying this, do check if there is a newer version of the firmware which may or may not have updates, fixes, and what have you. But, in terms of features, as well as, I'll get into the player in a bit, this, if you've seen any of my reviews before, this interface is made by HiFiGo Music, as are most of the DAP players out there, whether they're branded or not. And you'll probably see a lot of similar stuff going on here. We're just looking at the step player before recording steps. Lock the volume knob, I guess, when the screen is off, if you keep bumping the volume knob. We have screensaver settings. We already saw the album cover on there. I haven't played with dynamic cover yet. We have the ability to restore factory settings and update the firmware, of course, which you usually just put on the micro SD card, download and put on the micro SD card and update. Going back, if you want to see what languages are available, well, there you go. If you want to see it's available in your language, a quick scroll through there. Music database update. If you change cards around, it will automatically update if it's on auto. Brightness, of course, you can adjust as necessary. We want 100% of the video, otherwise it's going to look really dark. The backlight time, of course, which I set to stay on just simply because, well, we're recording a video and having it switch off is a pain. Color theme is pretty cool. I'm not going to play around with color theme stuff, but we can actually adjust how it looks, which it will, if you want to match it with your clothes or whatever, or just your preferences. A bit of appeal to maybe the ladies, I would guess, but all the same, something unique. The font size. Now this was interesting. I played where I switched to the large font size. Well, that's easy to see if you're maybe slightly vision impaired, but did you see that problem? USB mode, store, backlight time, stat. Okay, Someone did not think this out carefully. Well, you want to see what medium looks like? Let's have a quick look. Medium might be alright. Yeah, adjust. We'll go back to smalls. You'll see why in just a second, which is one other issue I have with this. Button operation when? When what? Usually if you... Can we find out? No. I'm guessing it was when the backlight is off, whether the buttons work or not. Time setting, idle timer as usual, how long before it switches off, which I probably should do because I end up flattening the battery of everything like I was going to compare to the channeling, and the channeling was completely flat, my fault. Battery percentage dis. Do we want to dis the battery percentage? Okay, display. Standby, whether you have standby mode. Inline remote. Now if you're using the 3.5mm socket and you have headphones or earphones which have an inline remote, you might want to have that on. Recording steps, which we looked at because I happen to have the screen backwards when I was opening the settings. Okay, so if you've already, I'll get into the other stuff pretty quickly. Bluetooth, well, one of the main things, if Bluetooth bypasses all the internal amplification, you get longer battery life. I mean, the battery life becomes dependent on your Bluetooth headphones, which often have, something like 20 to 30 hours of time anyway. Anything new will anyhow. So using these little players as a Bluetooth transmitter can be very handy. I have HiFiLink too, which allows remote controlling of a portable player via, say, a smartphone if you have the HiFi app on your smartphone. Quality priority, quality setting. This has the usual LDAC, quality priority. I don't know how reliable this will be. We'll just give it a go and we'll see how we go. Usually the auto is what they set it to, so it just goes down from 990 to 660 or 660 to 330 if the quality if it's not reliable. UAT I've not seen before. Well, UAT 1.2, that'll be interesting to find out what that is. aptX, which is the old standard, and SBC. Well, very rarely you may have to force SBC on something if you're using some kind of Bluetooth headset, where it's the only option. And well, Bluetooth volume adjuster is a new one, where you can, if your ability to control the volume doesn't match up nicely, you can increase or decrease the volume, which we'll talk about later. In the usual search pair and available devices, which I haven't hooked up anything at the moment of shooting the interface, because that will happen when you see get my sound impressions. So the player. Now, if you've seen any of the large DAPs, it's just a miniaturized version of the usual HiFi player, and you can see some HR marks there to show high res. This has got a SanDisk Ultra in it, not an Extreme, and it's fairly snappy. But a lot of the interface is just squished in various slightly different places to usual, but you get your usual... yes, there we go. You have your usual ability to select favorites, recent, which I've played a few things on it already, as you can see. You can just search files directly if something's not showing up or you don't want to go through the whole scan. As far as settings go, well, you don't have a large number of settings in here, but you do have the MSEB, which allows some temperature, well, some kind of adjustment to the sound. It's a bit like an EQ, but it does some other funky things. Play around with something worth playing around with. Some people may find it beneficial, say, if you have stuff that's, a bit too bright. It can, instead of having to work out how to EQ it, it just gives you simple options to, it's kind of like a guided EQ, more or less. Whether you want, I want the more vocals or less vocals, or note thickness and bass texture, and, something you can play around with. And it's a kind of a cool feature that was on the HiFi DAPs, and it's cool that they added that in here. If you want to just go straight with EQ, once you turn that on, you can just play around with stuff. This is not actually a real EQ that I put in here. I just was playing around with it before. I don't actually use that. And, well, actually the equalizer does have some options too, some presets, which you've probably seen on a bazillion DAPs before if you've watched any DAP reviews in the past. Your usual settings, play modes, DSD output mode, if you're outputting DSD, though why you'd put DSD on something this small, and yeah, we won't go there. DSD gain compensation, because DSD DSD clipping is nasty stuff, so to compensate for it, you usually add some gain because it has gain lowered. Resume playback position, which is very useful if you use these to listen to podcasts. Gapless playback. Sound field is interesting. That's a new one haven't seen on there. We'll talk about that in the sound impressions, I reckon. Max volume if you're giving it to a child and you don't want them to blow their ears out. Fixed power on volume again if you often turn up the volume high and you want to reset it to low for when you do stuff like switching from full-sized headphones to a pair of, say, Campfire Andromedas, which is the extreme thing which I've done before and hit play without realizing what the volume was. Usual balance control for people who need it. Anti-aliasing filter. I just tell people experiment and see if it makes any difference on the music you like. I usually say head towards brick wall or a fast roll-off apodizing, say, for acoustic music, and you probably want maybe something like minimum phase and slow roll-off towards electronic or modern pop music, which tends to go with that. But play around. Sometimes people notice a difference, sometimes people don't. Don't stress over it and worry about it too much. It's one of those things that goes very deep into the technicalities. Playthrough folders and playthrough albums is there too. So that, and if you want to get out of that, that is pretty much the interface. Sound-wise, well, the AP80 Pro only has kind of limited power. I mean, on the single-ended output, it's only 70 milliwatts. On the balanced output, it's only 190 milliwatts. But, 190 milliwatts is enough to get, well, loud enough. With full-sized headphones, well, you're going to hit that maximum 100 volume level pretty quickly. I mean, just on a pair of HD6XXs, yeah, it's just going to hit 100. It's going to be not particularly clear with those headphones, but, you can listen with it. With on the other end of the scale, the extremely sensitive Andromedas, well, I didn't pick up any particular hiss, which was good, which made it, well, a good IEM player. But it was apparent straight out of the single-ended output that it was obviously optimized for the balanced, as the sound quality was a distinct step down from the single-ended output. Whereas, things became much more optimum out of the balanced output. Though that output, I would say, the closest player I have to it is something like the M5 and, Shanling MO. And these players, well, yeah, they kind of do the job. A little bit kind of soft sounding maybe, and maybe not quite so clear as would be ideal. But all the same, they were, nice players to use. But their single-ended output only, that's no problem. I mean, optimized single-ended output I think is better. But optimizing around the balanced output, well, you really have to have balanced in-ear monitors or balanced headphones. I'd probably say some easy-to-drive headphones if you're going to use it for that, to be really useful with the AP80 Pro. So out of the overall sound was maybe a touch sharper than the little players. A bit, I would say, not a dramatic amount, but that touch of extra clarity and sharpness, maybe a bit more definition in the bass and treble, was countered a bit by the fact that the treble was maybe just a touch kind of harsh and unnatural. Maybe with more acoustic music, it was more noticeable. Instruments seemed a little bit touch grating. I mean, not unlistenable at all, but still not, high end or anything. I mean, it's not going to obviously beat, one of the big players like this M11 Pro sitting here. But still, I found it, I was sitting listening this morning quite happily, even with, very bright sounding in-ear monitors, such as these, completely, not really the kind of thing you'd match up. These $2,000 final A8000s, which do have a very sharp treble. It wasn't so, the sharpness wasn't a problem with this, where you kind of noticed, because I've listened with a lot of gear with the A8000s, that these kinds of little players are a little bit mushy and unclear sounding, and there was, the AP80 Pro was no exception, but still, it was, for a cheap DAP, I mean, something I'd take on the go, absolutely. Again, with that limitation, the balanced out is going to be considerably better. Now, of course, another thing you can do with this is you can actually tweak the sound, as we saw. So, for example, I was listening to some good old Nora Jones because it came up randomly. Now, you remember in the settings we had that sound field option. So, going back in here, which you can adjust while playing, we have sound field. Now, by turning that on, it ranges from 0 even to -1. Now, -1 kind of gives a kind of crossfade option, so you can, maybe if you have something like old Beatles tracks which are extremely panned, extremely left and right, or old jazz tracks, you can kind of reduce the sound field. But going the other direction, whereas say Nora Jones's voice was like dead on in the middle, it was going above the going into a higher level, kind of made it more diffuse sounding. So instead of Nora Jones being dead in the center, it made everything sound diffuse, a lot like a kind of 3D buttons on some headphones. Back to the MSEB. Well, that is, as I said, literally basically it's a kind of guided EQ system. So, for example, if you change the temperature, warm, dark, cool, bright, it adjusts kind of the amount of bass. If you go cool, bright, it kind of drops the bass right down, whereas if you go warm, dark, it kind of drops the treble right down instead. And you have the other things, just basically adjust different frequencies according to the kind of effect they'll have, more or less, on the music. So that, well, we can play around with that. Might be useful, especially like I was just using the Andromedas and are a little bit thick sounding, so making it more cool, bright, which drops the bass down, was kind of good for some music. With Bluetooth too, though they won't fit on screen, I have the good old, Sony WM1000 XM4s in for review. Actually, I bought them Sony doesn't send me stuff. I'm not that important. But I did run the LDAC quality priority on it. And, well, I haven't tested the performance, outdoors or maybe out in public when there's a lot more wireless around, but it works, is all I can say so far. Something to note that some people have had issues with players, maybe they stick them in their pocket and trying to use wireless headphones. Maybe full connection quality might not work so well, but, it worked, and the sound quality with some high quality tracks that I played was good. So I can say that at least the Bluetooth works, at least in my home, which there's not a lot of wireless around. So at least it does work. So that's kind of how the AP80 Pro goes. Some good, some not perfect. I wish they'd done a really good single-ended output. I still think is better for various reasons I've gone into in other videos. But still, as a $150, $160 player, depending on options, yeah, okay, it does nicely. So I hope that gave you a good overview of the AP80 Pro, and thanks to everyone who's been supporting these videos. Again, if you'd like my buying advice, or if you'd just like to support me, and a lot of people would like to do that and help me make these videos, do consider signing up and becoming a patron. And for that, you get to see my impressions of gear in advance. As soon as I get gear in, you can ask me questions. I'll help you out, buy stuff and buy the right stuff for your system. So it could save you way more than just a couple of bucks a month for signing up. And you can happily sign up and ask me questions. And let me help you as you help me. And join in on the chat and everything we have going on for all the patrons. So thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.